Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by AJC. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Joining us today is AJC CEO David Harris, one of the Jewish world's leading experts on global trends, who will take us around the world to discuss some of the key issues that AJC is focusing on. Described by the late Israeli President Shimon Peres as the foreign minister of the Jewish people, David Harris has led AJC since 1990. Moderating this conversation is Jillian Laskowitz, AJC's Deputy Chief of Staff to the CEO. After we hear from David and Jillian, time permitting, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org, that is questions plural, or use the Q&A chat feature in Zoom. Jillian, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and welcome to our worldwide audience. David, it's great to be with you again for another Around the World session. And as we meet here, Bahrain is actually making history, sending its foreign minister to Israel for the first time. Secretary Pompeo is also in Israel today. So can you start us off by explaining to our audience what this all means?
Sure. First of all, hello to our worldwide audience, and it's nice, Jillian, to begin on a positive note. As you said, the Foreign Minister of Bahrain arrived today in Israel. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo also arrived in Israel. It was not a coincidence that they were all there at the same time. And this is taking the Abraham Accords to the next level. Bahrain and Israel have indicated that they want to achieve several things. They want to open embassies in each other's countries. They want to establish a visa-free regime, which will make it easy for people to travel back and forth. They want to establish regular direct flights. They want to encourage tourism between the countries. And of course, they want to encourage trade, commerce, and investment. So this is all very good and welcome news in what may be an emerging new Middle East, Jillian.
It's electrifying. And since our last Around the World program, we witnessed a historic and contentious election here in the United States. What do you think? What can we expect from a Biden administration and areas of greatest concern to AJC, including the Middle East?
Well, again, let me remind our audience that we are stubbornly, steadfastly nonpartisan. So please read into both the questions and the answers, an attempt to analyze and not to advocate or endorse or oppose parties or candidates. I think the Biden administration, from AJC's perspective, will have a couple of overarching challenges. One challenge is what, if anything, can be done to try and address the issue of polarization in the United States. The Biden administration won, but the elections themselves, if you look at all the results on the state, congressional, and other levels, once again revealed a very divided America. And it's not just divided over candidates. In many ways, it's divided over more fundamental questions of identity and values. So can the Biden administration take steps, beginning with rhetorical steps and over time policy steps that help sort of bridge the divide in America, which is a very troubling divide. It's a very concerning divide for anyone who cares about the health and well-being of this great country. On foreign policy, the question will be, how active will the Biden administration be? How much will it attempt to reassert American leadership? The Trump administration emphasized the notion of America first. It also spoke about sort of bringing America back home to repair America. Will the Biden administration go back out into the world, and will it do so in a more multilateral fashion? And of course, our greatest interest at AJC is the Middle East. And here we have both opportunities and challenges. You, Jillian, reminded us of the opportunities. The first being the fact that the foreign minister of Bahrain made his first ever official visit to Israel today. That represents the new Middle East, the Middle East of Bahrain and the UAE and other countries who want to engage with Israel. But then there's the other Middle East, and the Biden administration will have to address that. And that's the Middle East of Iran and its proxies, principally Hezbollah. That's the Middle East of Turkey. That's the Middle East of Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood. So there are two Middle East going on here. And for the Biden administration, how they engage with both Middle Easts will be vitally important for our country and, of course, for the American Jewish Committee.
Yeah, and just to follow up there, the issue of the US-Israel relationship, which we care deeply about, will also be on the table. So what are your thoughts and predictions on the relationship going forward?
Well, let me dial back for a moment to, if I recall, January of 2008. That was during the presidential election year. And I had just been to Florida for AJC, and a New York Times reporter found me and asked what was the mood among Jewish voters that I had met with regarding the presidential election, and more specifically, Barack Obama's ascending candidacy. And I said to the New York Times reporter, for many of the Jews with whom I met, the big question about Barack Obama was, does he have Israel in his kishkas, using the Yiddish term for in his gut? And that appeared in the New York Times article. And that became the kind of question that was being asked in Florida and elsewhere among some, because for many pro-Israel voters, whether then or now, it's not just about whether a candidate has Israel in her or his head, but also in their gut. They're looking for something more, an understanding of sort of the uniqueness of Israel's story. I say that because I think in the case of Joe Biden, no one is asking the question about whether Israel's in his kishkas. Israel is in his kishkas. And that's not just wishful thinking. Anyone who's followed his career going back to the 1970s knows that Israel has loomed large in his life. And in fact, as recently as this week, he was speaking with Israeli leaders and reaffirming the relationship. Now, that does not mean that there won't be moments of tension, moments of difference between a Biden administration and any Israeli government. But what I'm trying to say is the starting point for the US-Israel relationship in the Biden administration is a positive starting point, because Joe Biden himself embodies the last 50 years of the relationship between the US and Israel.
Comforting to hear. And just keeping in mind our nonpartisan approach to these issues, are there certain policy positions from the Trump years that you wish Joe Biden would embrace rather than reject?
It's a great question. Let me just sort of anecdotalize this for a moment. When our oldest child was maybe 3 or 4 years old, my wife had a very close friend who had a child the same age. And for some reason, our son did not like that little girl. And my wife kept kind of pressing our son, you need to like her, you need to like her. It's embarrassing. And one day our son looked at my wife, again, he was maybe 3, possibly 4, and he said, I dislike her so much, Mom, that I even hate her shoes. Now, in this polarized America in which we live, the people who like Joe Biden and welcome the Biden administration, in many cases are likely to say, I hate Donald Trump so much and everything he embodies, I even hate his shoes. And for us, I think it's important to say, well, wait, slow down here. We're nonpartisans, but yes, there are some things that one should take a page from. And again, I begin with the Abraham Accords. The Trump administration deserves enormous credit. They're not getting it in every quarter for a variety of political and other reasons, Jillian, but they deserve the credit. It happened on their watch and as a result of their efforts. The breakthroughs with the UAE, Bahrain, and Sudan were not insignificant. Some are trying to dismiss them. They're trying to label them as transactional, as if diplomacy does not involve transactionalism. It does. And as if they were not historic landmark. They are historic and landmark. And what's the secret that they brought to the table? First and foremost, they were no longer captive of this kind of prevailing notion in parts of Washington, in parts of Brussels, and elsewhere in Europe, that all roads to the Arab world lead through Ramallah in the West Bank. And to illustrate, dial back to 2016 when Secretary of State John Kerry spoke at the Brookings Institution in December. This is easily available through Google. And he asked himself the question, can there be separate peace between Israel and Arab states absent a Palestinian deal? And he answered the question with such vigor in saying, no, 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 and no. 4 times he said no. The Trump administration answer to that was the first no became the UAE, the second no became Bahrain, the third no became Sudan, and it's anyone's speculation who the 4th no might become. So yes, this is one important part of what the Trump administration did achieve, for which they deserve full credit. And the second thing, Julian, I know we have limited time, is the Trump administration understood that Iran was not going to adhere both to the letter and the spirit of the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. Now, in saying that, I'm not saying that the Trump administration necessarily had the answer to how to deal with the deception of Iran, the malign behavior of Iran in every respect. But they saw through the weaknesses of the deal. And in our judgment, they were right to see the weaknesses in the deal. And they were right to impose maximum pressure on Iran, which is what they've been doing. And from all reports on Iran's economy, on Iran's currency, Iran is suffering a great deal. And if the new administration is going to take a different approach to Iran, I hope it doesn't throw out the baby with the bathwater. We have Iran on the ropes in many ways now. And I hope that we will keep them on the ropes until they agree to a far different deal, if it's possible. And I don't know that it's possible, Julian, but a deal that extends the timelines of the original deal, that addresses ballistic missile development, that addresses nefarious regional behavior, and that addresses the weaknesses in the inspections regime. Just one illustration. On October the 18th, so what, a month ago today, the arms embargo on Iran legally ended. Now that was part of the deal, which means that legally Iran can buy and more important and sell weapons to countries like Turkey, China, Russia, Venezuela, Cuba. That's the first of the agreements that expired, Jillian. The others are coming down the pike. So on both of these issues, for starters, I think the new administration needs to pause and say, wait a second, just because it has, the Made in Trump land sign on it, doesn't mean we discard it, throw it in the wastebasket. We need to take a careful look at what's going on here.
Right, and I know we'll be actively engaged on all of these issues. Last week, David, CNN's Christiane Amanpour actually likened Kristallnacht to the Trump era, to which she then apologized for this week on air. Can you explain to our audience how AJC handled the situation?
So yes, for those who may not have followed the story, Christiane Amanpour, I believe on the 12th of November, which was last Thursday on air, had a commentary which began with references to Kristallnacht, that is November 9th, 10th, 1938, which some rightly see as, in a way, the start of the Holocaust. Kristallnacht in German means the night of broken glass. And scores of Jews were murdered. Some 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and deported. Dachau and to Buchenwald and to other concentration camps. Over 1,000 synagogues were damaged or destroyed, and literally thousands of Jewish-owned shops and businesses were damaged and destroyed in this paroxysm of genocidal hatred and murder. And Christian Amanpour, a well-known journalist, many of us watch, framed Kristallnacht as the prelude to her assault on the Trump administration. And what she said was the Trump administration's assault on facts and history and truth. Now, what I said in an op-ed that was published a couple of days ago, Gillian, which was an open letter to Christian Amanpour, was really two things. And I tried to write it in a respectful way. I mean, she is a well-known journalist. And our goal at AJC is not just to score points with the bleachers, it's also hopefully to engage people with whom we disagree and maybe to encourage them to see things a little differently. The first point was in her description of Kristallnacht, all the words I just used, Jews, synagogues, Jewish-owned businesses, were absent. Kristallnacht was in a way universalized as this assault on, as she said, facts and history and truth. Well, yes, it was an assault on facts and history and truth. It was an assault on Jews, and that was missing. And it was especially troubling, Gillian, because several recent surveys have revealed the abysmal ignorance of people today, both in the United States and Europe, about the Holocaust more generally. So here was a potential teaching moment by a respected journalist, and it was lost in this kind of universalization of Kristallnacht. It wasn't just a moral tale about facts and history and truth. It was the beginning of the genocide against the Jewish people and against people like my father, who was in Austria at the time when Kristallnacht was unleashed, both in Austria and in Germany. And the second point was that whether she intended it or not, and it's not for me to try and probe her motivation, what she was doing was weaponizing Kristallnacht, weaponizing the Holocaust to make her point about Donald Trump. What I said in my op-ed was, you're entitled to your beliefs about Donald Trump. I'm not here to debate your views on Donald Trump. I'm here to say that the next time, please express your views on Donald Trump without instrumentalizing or invoking the Holocaust as the parallel. Whatever you may think of Donald Trump is not arresting 30,000 Jews or others and sending them to American versions of Dachau and Buchenwald. And nor are thousands of shops and synagogues being torched and razed to the ground. And I must say, to her credit, it took several days, but yesterday, or actually the day before, I think, she went on air on her same program and she apologized. And she said that she should never have linked the two. The two are not comparable. That is, Kristallnacht and the horrors of the Holocaust, as she said, with the Trump administration. And we expressed our gratitude and we move on.
Thank you, David. It's an important story of AJC's advocacy really at work in action. Also,
by the way, then I would add that the story's been picked up by AP. It's been published in the Washington Post, and those who are watching this call, if they want, can read more about it in the Washington Post or in the AP feed, or by going to the AJC website, where you can see the original, our original op-ed and how the story unfolded.
Absolutely. Also in the news a lot has been Turkey. Turkey seems to be, let's say, on the other side of issues of more and more concern to the United States and to AJC. Is that a correct perception? And what should policy look like vis-a-vis Turkey?
Well, on a lighter note, Gillian, if we were having this discussion next week and we were going to talk Turkey, I'd have to say happy Thanksgiving at the end of my answer. But we're a week early, although I'm happy to wish everyone a happy Thanksgiving in this strange environment in which we're all living. But you're absolutely right to point the finger at Turkey. And I think, by the way, this will be one of the major challenges for the Biden administration as well. When I spoke a few moments ago about the Middle East, one of the major challenges will be, how do we deal with a country that at one and the same time is so centrally and strategically located, is one of the early and longest standing members of NATO, that houses very important American strategic assets on the ground. And yet at the same time, increasingly has aligned itself with Iran, with Qatar, with Hamas, with the Muslim Brotherhood, in opposition to core American interests in the region, in opposition to Israel, including, by the way, the Abraham Accords, including housing Hamas officials in Turkey, and not only focusing on the Middle East, but focusing on the vital Eastern Mediterranean, which is a region that today has key American allies, beginning with Greece and Cyprus, who themselves have forged a close relationship with Israel, something that AJC has encouraged since the 1980s and which has come to fruition. Key energy assets which have been discovered in recent years and which make the Eastern Mediterranean particularly important to global energy supplies, to Western energy supplies. So how to deal with Turkey is not a simple issue, but it is an urgent issue, absolutely urgent. Joe Biden knows the region quite well. Both in Cyprus and Greece, he's considered a close friend of those countries. And I dare say, in looking ahead, we're going to be hearing a lot about Turkey. And how the Biden administration deals with Turkey will be one of the indices of how its foreign policy will unfold.
Thank you, David. And just moving more to Europe, David, working in your department, I know the foreign minister of Poland recently called you and he invited you to speak at a ministerial conference on religious freedom, which was yesterday, hosted by the Polish Foreign Ministry. Can you explain to our audience about the importance of a conference like this and speaking on this issue?
With pleasure. So you're right. The new foreign minister of Poland, Foreign Minister Rao, called me a few weeks ago, and he asked me if I would participate in a session which took place yesterday. This was a global conference on freedom of religion. It was actually begun by the US government, hosted by the State Department for the last 2 years, 2018, 2019, addressed by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and other world leaders. And in this, the third year, Poland agreed to host it. And I was invited to be one of the speakers. I was together with the UN Special Rapporteur on religious intolerance and the chair of the US Commission on International Religious Freedom, which is a body that was created by the US Congress and reports both to the Congress and the president. And the three of us were talking about the state of religious freedom and the state of threats to religious freedom, including, by the way, in the era of COVID. And among the main points that I tried to make, representing an organization that has been focused on religious freedom for literally 100 years. In fact, I mentioned yesterday that the very first amicus brief that we filed to the United States Supreme Court was in the 1920s in a case that sought to defend the rights of Catholic parents to send their children to Catholic parochial schools in the state of Oregon when that state's governor had banned Catholic schools in the state. So we're credentialed on this issue. And over the last 100 years, whether it's the rights of Jews or the rights of other religious communities, we have been there to stand up for and to defend those rights. And those rights continue to be under assault in many places. You mentioned Turkey a few moments ago, Gillian. Many know about the difficulties of the Greek Orthodox Church and the ecumenical patriarch in Istanbul, faced with the Erdogan regime. If one looks at Iran, the fate of the Baha'is, for example, it should be on people's minds. If we look throughout the region, the fate of the Yazidis. If we look in many parts of the world, the fate of Christians more generally. In some parts of the world, the fate of Muslims, the Uyghurs in China, the Rohingya in Myanmar. And of course, for Jews, we continue to face anti-Semitism in very serious ways. In fact, this week, Gillian, and I mentioned it in my presentation yesterday, this week, the FBI issued its statistics for 2019 on hate crimes. More than 60% of all religiously motivated hate crimes in the United States in 2019 were directed at Jews. Jews constitute barely 2% of the American population. So we're overrepresented by a factor of 30 in religiously motivated hate crimes. So protecting religious freedom, protecting the rights of religious communities is an ongoing challenge. And I felt very honored that AJC was asked to be the Jewish voice in this important intergovernmental conference that was held yesterday.
Thank you, David. And just staying in Europe for a moment, since the terrorist attacks in France and Austria, there's been a greater debate over France and this issue of secularism in society, which has gotten some rough treatment in the American press. So my question is, do France and the US have the same approach to what we call the separation of church and state? What's your take on it?
Thank you for the question, Gillian. It's an important question, and the answer is no. France and the United States do not have the same sort of conceptual model. Here in the United States, we refer to separation of church and state. And we assume, therefore, that this must be the model for how you manage relations between religion and state in any democratic country which wants to avoid the entanglement of religion and state. By the way, for the sake of both. Not only for the sake of the state, but for the sake of, if you will, the authenticity of religion. France took a very different model. And that was rooted in the specificity of French history, which is a different history than American history. After all, those who came to America in 1620 and beyond were pilgrims seeking religious freedom as one of their core principles. So the principle of affirming religious freedom was central to the American ethos. In France, after the French Revolution, the ethos was to reject the statist power of the church and the religious wars that Europe had seen, including on French soil, between Catholics and Protestants. So the French goal, first and foremost, was to kind of separate from religion, push it away. The American goal was much more, if you will, even-handed. And just, 115 years ago or so, France adopted a law which sort of becomes known as laïcité in French, which roughly translated in English means secularism. Secularism is not the same as separation of church and state. Secularism, and I'm simplifying it, essentially means that there is no space for religion in the public sphere. It does not mean that the state, France, in any way represses or restricts religion or practice or worship. But what it says is, that's for the private sphere. Please, there are mosques, there are churches, there are synagogues if you wish to go. That's your business. But in public, we don't discuss religion. We don't ask you what your religion is. We don't expect you to ask us what our religion is. We don't wear religious symbols as public officials. We don't have religious symbols on our walls. By the way, in some European countries, even today, when I visit, I'm still struck by seeing particularly crucifixes by the way, also in some Latin American countries, in official buildings. You will never find that in France. So what France is saying is, when Samuel Paty, the history and geography teacher, was attacked and beheaded, that it was not just an attack by a jihadist on one individual, though it was an attack on the state, because he, as a teacher, was part of the effort by the state to teach children about the core values of France, including laïcité, including freedom of expression, including freedom of satire. And that did not mean that France endorsed the satire against a religion. It meant that it was prepared to defend the satire as part of its value system. Some of the students couldn't understand it, and we all know what happened to Samuel Paty. And then not long thereafter, 3 more people were killed in a Catholic church in Nice. So if you listen to President Macron, the French president, and if you follow the press sort of discussions in France and the United States, Gillian, you'll see this vigorous debate where France is saying, you, the American press and others, are misrepresenting and mischaracterizing what the nature of laïcité is. It's not anti-religion. It's anti-religion only in the public space. And it allows for the full protection of worship and speech. And there's a lot of tension going back and forth because of this misunderstanding between countries and cultures.
Thank you, David. It's important context to help understand the situation. And just to follow up, since the attacks, we've heard from the French president and the Austrian chancellor over their concerns over political Islam in their countries. What are they talking about? What can we understand from their own perspectives?
So again, you're using their language and I'm using their language. This is not our language. This is the language of, as you said, French President Macron and Austrian Chancellor Sebastian Kurz. Since Austria was also attacked, the center of Vienna was the venue for another jihadist attack and more fatalities, which brought Kurz and Macron together in Paris for many hours of discussion, and this kind of common commitment to fighting what they call political Islam. And what they're saying, as I understand it, is that this is those who are seeking to politicize Islam and to advance a violent agenda, and to create a kind of ecosystem in France, in Austria, and elsewhere, which is not just about the actual perpetrators of these attacks, but the kind of environment which recruits them, which educates them, which brainwashes them, which incites them. And so this is, if you will, the second tier. The first tier are the attackers themselves that need to be stopped and that are the focus of interior ministries and the equivalent of the FBI in all of these countries. They're saying there's a second, larger concentric circle which needs more attention than it's gotten until now. And that is, if you will, the breeding ground. Do these people just come out of nowhere? Where do they come from? Is it from online recruitment and incitement? Is it from certain mosques? Is it from certain circles or groups? And they're also asking, where's the funding coming from? Is the funding coming locally or is it coming from outside? And their conclusion, as I understand it, is much of the funding is coming from outside, that there are outside forces, for example, from Iran, from Turkey, from the Muslim Brotherhood, from elsewhere, that are in effect encouraging this kind of religious violence, or violence in the name of religion, I should say, misguided religion. And so they're now trying to address this second concentric circle of the soil from which these attackers come. As I understand it, and as I've heard the analysis of our AJC offices on the ground, we're blessed in the sense that we are we are a Jewish organization that has major offices in a number of European cities, staff who know the countries, the cultures, the governments, the societies extremely well, are able to interact directly with them, and also able to provide us with the kind of contextual information which allows us to understand these issues at a much deeper level. That, I think, is part of the uniqueness of the American Jewish Committee today.
Right. And I know AJC will continue to have all of these conversations with European governments on this issue. And just yesterday, David.
We must.
Just yesterday, David, the UK Labour Party reinstated Jeremy Corbyn, the former leader of the party, who had been suspended several weeks ago for a number of anti-Semitic statements he had made. In your mind, what does this decision tell us?
Well, here I can borrow from our close friends in Britain, beginning with the Board of Deputies of British Jews, who have made several statements voicing their outrage. I mean, their outrage. It's said in a variety of different and very colorful ways, Jillian, that this is a major retreat for the Labour Party. And whatever technicality might have been used to bring Jeremy Corbyn back into the ranks of the party. And by the way, there's even some discussion about whether he might be given the role of party whip, which in any political party, whether in the United States or the UK, is an important assignment. It's not clear whether he gets it or not, but the fact that it's even under discussion has just sort of awoken the anger of British Jews, and by the way, of many others, including non-Jews, who left the Labour Party while Corbyn was its leader, and who were hoping that under the new leadership of the Labour Party, and the good sounds that were coming from that new leadership initially, things would radically change. Now all the old questions are back. Has the new Labour Party really reinvented itself? Or is it just the old Labour Party with kind of a new gift wrapping, but down deep, nothing much has changed? Now, again, our audience needs to remember, because Jeremy Corbyn quickly faded the moment he was outed and ousted. But Jeremy Corbyn has countenanced anti-Semitism in the Labour Party during all the years of his leadership. Many would argue that he actually fomented it. He had extraordinarily hostile feelings towards Israel, towards the very creation of Israel, towards the notion of Zionism. He was associated with many of Israel's foremost enemies. At one point, he called leaders of Hamas and Hezbollah his friends. He was caught on camera many years ago laying a wreath at a monument to the terrorists who killed Israeli athletes in 1972 at the Munich Olympics. He was very close, he is very close to the corrupt leaders in Venezuela, in Iran, in Cuba. This was the leader of the once venerable British Labour Party, the Labour Party that had been led by great figures like Tony Blair and Gordon Brown in recent years alone. So there's still a lot of reckoning to be done here, Gillian, in terms of how the Labour Party handles Jeremy Corbyn's return. And it's not enough for spin artists to try and find the right words to kind of get through this. And an awful lot of people are going to be watching, including our friends at the Board of Deputies, our friends at the Jewish Leadership Council, our friends at the CST, our friends at the Holocaust Education Trust, all those venerable British Jewish institutions with which AJC works and collaborates, and we share their anguish.
Absolutely. And just keeping an eye on the time, this will be my last question before turning it back over to Daniel for audience Q&A, because I see there are many. And just staying on anti-Semitism, but here at home in the United States, since we had our last session with you, there's been much discussion generated by AJC and our recent groundbreaking surveys on rising levels of anti-Semitism here in the United States. Can you talk to us about the surveys and the key takeaways from them for our audience?
I can, but I would encourage our audience, if they haven't already seen the surveys, to go to ajc.org, to go to our website, and to download the surveys. They are full of really interesting and important data. But to summarize, there were actually two surveys. One survey was a survey of the general American public on their understanding of and attitudes towards anti-Semitism. The second survey was a large representative sampling of American Jews and how we Jews see anti-Semitism today. And each survey is revealing in its own right. But then when you juxtapose the two surveys, you see some important gaps. For example, 46% of the general American population either does not know what the word anti-Semitism means. If I recall, that was 21%, so 1 in 5, Jillian, or another 25% have heard the term, but can't really explain what the term is. Again, I repeat, in the year 2020, 46% of the general American population, according to this authoritative AJC study, either do not know what anti-Semitism is or only have at best a vague notion. So if one's looking for concern, there's a concerning starting point. And then when you couple it with the lack of awareness of the Holocaust, which I referenced in your question about Christian Amanpour, and what surveys are showing about these vast swaths of Americans and Europeans, especially younger people, who have no clue what the Holocaust was. No name recognition, even for the word Auschwitz. No sense of the number 6 million or anything close to it. We have a big problem. We Jews, and collectively we as societies. For the Jewish survey, what was most striking to me was that nearly 90% of American Jews believe that anti-Semitism today is a very serious problem. If you look down, deeper down into the survey, you'll see how many Jews avoid wearing anything identifiably Jewish, how many Jews have experienced anti-Semitism, how many Jews have failed to report those incidents because they may not trust the system, how important a role social media plays in dealing with anti-Semitism. So these surveys have been distributed widely to federal, state, and local officials. We're talking to many of those officials in a very deeper way, Jillian, in order to deal with the consequences. We're not just trying to put the numbers out there. We're putting the numbers out there for a reason. There's a problem. It's a big problem. If anything, it's a growing problem. It's a problem here. It's a problem in Europe. It's a problem elsewhere. And ignoring or minimizing or denying the problem is not going to encourage solutions. AJC is about finding solutions based on data. Here's the data. Now we're talking about possible solutions.
Thank you, David. And our work continues, as you said. Daniel, audience questions, please.
Thank you, Jillian. And I'll just remind our listeners that you can go to ajc.org/antisemitism report 2020 to review that report. Our first question comes from Steve Schuster in New York. David, what can the United States do to address the concern that it does not adequately support its allies in the Middle East? Concerns have arisen since the Obama administration failed to take action against Assad for crossing the, quote, red line when he used chemical weapons, and with Trump for failure to respond after Iran attacked Saudi oil fields and his abandonment of the Kurds.
So it's a big question. Thank you, Steve, for the question. I can only answer in a way telegraphically. When I said earlier that the Middle East will present enormous challenges and yes, some opportunities for the Biden administration. I mean, each of the administrations in recent memory, I can go through each one. I can add to the Trump administration the feeling among many Kurds that the Kurds themselves have been abandoned. Were two of the low points in the Obama administration. There were several low points, certainly as we saw them. One was, as you noted, the establishment of the red line in Syria, and then the abandonment of the red line in Syria, which sent the wrong message in the region and also in a way helped encourage the Russians to come into the region, unfortunately in a very skillful way. A second mistake by the Obama administration, we believe, was its willingness to engage with the Muslim Brotherhood and the way the Obama administration handled Egypt. If the alternative to Hosni Mubarak had been a Jeffersonian Democrat, it might have been one thing. But the alternative to Hosni Mubarak was the Muslim Brotherhood, which gained power and rattled the entire region and raised questions among other Arab leaders, with the United States also walk away from them. And then, of course, a third issue in the Obama years was the Iran deal, which we've already discussed. Now, it's easy to second guess when you're outside government. These issues are many, they're fast, they're furious, they're complex, and often don't have sort of easy exit ramps. The Biden administration will now face all of those issues. And I enumerated many of them earlier in this conversation. And I don't expect them to get them all right, but I hope they'll have as good a batting averages as possible in an extraordinarily important but complex part of the world.
Thank you, David. I want to put two questions together that are sort of along the same lines. The first from Trisha Ullman in Kansas City and Ray Termini, who are asking a question about the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. How worried should we be about the progressive wing of the Democratic Party? And if you have any assessment of the new freshman class that's coming in. And secondly, from Herb Horowitz in New Jersey, who's asking about the polarization in this country and how it's not only a major challenge to Joe Biden, but also to AJC's nonpartisan stance into the challenge of bipartisan support for Israel. So how will AJC plan to confront that challenge?
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. Three great questions from three friends. Look, it's clear, and AJC has been saying this for quite some time, to use the German word, that there's a Kulturkampf, or what might be called a culture war inside the Democratic Party. And there has been for a while. It's impossible to pretend it doesn't exist. And it's also impossible to believe that it ended on November the 3rd, or whenever the official outcome of the election of this year may have occurred. It continues, and we see it in the news where the left wing of the party continues to insist, demand, confront, oppose potential appointments, propose other appointments. So that continues. I think, though, for moderates in this country, of whatever stripe, but moderates in this country, the election on November 3rd was really interesting and in some ways, frankly, quite encouraging. Because at the end of the day, if one is honest in the analysis, I believe the American electorate was largely rejecting extremism, especially when you got past the presidential election. I mean, you see what happens. I mean, I'm just repeating what everyone has now heard a gazillion times. There was no blue tidal wave in the Senate that overthrew Mitch McConnell and the Republican majority, and we're now sort of all waiting with bated breath for the results in two Georgia elections on January the 5th. But Republicans have at least 50 seats, so all they need is one more to regain control. House Democrats believed that they would win at least 10, 15, if not more, additional seats in the House. They're losing seats. The margin is narrowing. And what do we see, Daniel? What do we see in the process? We now see within the Democratic Party ranks increasing frustration openly expressed by moderates who are attacking the left-wingers and saying, you want to introduce terms like abolish ICE and defund the police and in effect end capitalism, you're going to destroy our party. We barely made it through these elections, especially those of us who represent purple districts. So you're beginning to see the moderate wing of the party, not just at the top with Joe Biden, but throughout the party, pushing back against a very noisy and committed group of left-wingers, but at the end of the day, understanding that their path to future victory, they believe, is going to be in the moderate lane, not in the extreme lane. And one should not confuse decibel level or even Twitter following with votes on the ground. By the way, in the spirit of nonpartisanship, is the Kulturkampf coming in the Republican Party? In the belief that Donald Trump at the end, unless there are some extraordinary court decisions, will in fact leave office on January 20th and be replaced by Joe Biden. Will the Republican Party continue to follow the image and the flag and the banner of Donald Trump? And what will people like Mitt Romney and other more sort of Jeb Bush, more classical Republicans do about trying to sort of regain the party in their image? So I don't doubt that there could well be a kind of internal reckoning as well. To Herb Horowitz, if anything, our nonpartisanship at AJC is even more important. We've been able to maintain it through the last 4 years through a very tumultuous presidential election. And I'd even add, Herb, that there are leading figures in both parties, cabinet figures in the Trump administration that I could cite, Senate and House members from the Democratic Party who've all said publicly AJC's nonpartisanship is even more important today because you create for us a meeting ground which we otherwise may not have. You create the grounds for civil discussions, purposeful discussions, because you, AJC, are policy-driven, not party-driven. So if anything, Herb, I would argue that while some other organizations out there may pretend to be nonpartisan, but in reality are in fact quite partisan, there are other organizations, including very centrally AJC, that are authentically nonpartisan, not just because we're a 501c3 and the law demands it, but because temperamentally we are nonpartisan in the belief that, yes, as that official said, we are about policies. We are not about parties. We are about values, not about voters. So we're sticking to it, and we're finding that, frankly speaking, it's ever increasingly popular.
Thank you, David. I think we have time for one more question, and we have a hypothetical question here from Dave Forrest in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. If you were advising the Prime Minister of Israel, are there any actions you would urge him to take before there is a new occupant in the Oval Office, or would any such action be a mistake because it would start things off on the wrong foot for a new administration?
Well, I think that if I were a politician or an official, I'd probably try and get out of that question by saying, I don't do hypotheticals, but I'm neither a politician nor an official. And if Dave Forrest wants to ask that question, I'm happy to try and answer it. Again, I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu, who at least for the foreseeable future is Israel's leader until the next election, whenever that may come, understands the United States very well. He knows Joe Biden very well. He knows most of the names that are being floated for top policy positions, whether foreign policy or defense and security policy. He knows them very well. And I'm sure that he will be sort of taking into account that vast sort of treasure trove of knowledge. Now, it does not mean that he will necessarily adjust every Israeli policy to accommodate his reading of the Biden and company mindset. That's not what leaders do. Leaders do much more intricate calculations that say, well, on this, I'm going to make a gesture because I know it's important to them. I want to start on the right foot. But on certain other issues, I can't, because I believe that they may be, in a sense, too important to the Israeli national interest. So I'll offer two illustrations in our remaining moments, Daniel. One is the issue of settlements. Now, this is just my guess, but Prime Minister Netanyahu knows very well that if he moves early on settlements in the Biden administration, it's a red flag, and it's going to set off voices in the White House, particularly among Democrats in Congress, and it's going to force a confrontation. So the Prime Minister has to ask himself, should I do it? Is there a compelling enough reason to do it and incur the price? Or maybe this is something where, you know what, I can let this pass for now. It's not that important in any case. I'm moving ahead with UAE and Bahrain and Sudan. They too would get upset. So I'm going to hold back. I think that's very possible. On the other hand, the Prime Minister will likely say on the issue of Iran, for me, it's non-negotiable, because for me, it's an existential question for the state of Israel and for the region. I'm going to do my best to work with the Biden administration. I'm going to see how much they have changed in their thinking, having been out of office for the last 4 years and having witnessed the last 5 years of the history of the Iran nuclear deal. If I find that they've changed and they're open to new thinking, I'm plunging right in and engaging. If I find that they're back to their original thinking, nothing has changed, no influence of recent events on their thinking about the deal, then I'm going to have to draw a line in the sand. So I think if you watch the Iran issue, or this is to Dave Forrest in the audience, if you watch the Iran issue and if you watch the settlements issue, there'll be two early indications of how U.S.-Israel relations are managed and how potential friction points in particular are addressed.
David, thank you so much for this past hour. It's always a pleasure to sit down with you and to get your take on what's going on in the world. And there's certainly always a lot to discuss. So thank you.
Julian, thank you, and thank our audience. And again, because there's been a lot of heavy-duty news, I don't want the audience to forget where you began the conversation, Julian. You began with good news. So let me remind us of the good news. The Foreign Minister of Bahrain, a country that had not been at peace with Israel in the past, is, as we speak, in Israel, talking about new embassies, trade, investment, tourism, direct flights. Those are the possibilities, and we at AJC will do everything we can, as we have these last 25 years, to encourage just such transformational developments.
Absolutely. And Daniel, back to you to close us out.
Thank you both again for another trip around the world. I'd also like to thank our global audience for joining us today. If you enjoyed this program, please consider making a donation to AJC at ajc.org/donate. Thank you again, everyone, and goodbye.